Hello and welcome back to the official Scottish Rugby Podcast. I'm Jamie McMillan, and joining Al Kellock, Rachel Malcolm and I this week is Scottish Rugby's Chief Operating Officer Dominic McKay, Director of Rugby Development Sheila Begbie, and Chief Medical Officer Dr James Robson to give us all an update on the current COVID-19 situation. All, thank you very much for joining us here on the podcast. Dominic, I'll come to you first, if I may. You had meetings last Friday with the government, but just I think what we're looking for now is that the latest progress around Scottish Rugby and this whole COVID-19 crisis.
Thanks, Jamie. Afternoon, everybody. I think I'm going to give a little bit of an update on where we're getting to as an organisation in respect of our thoughts and deliberations around the crisis that we've spoken about on here before. As you know, we established a threat management group many weeks ago now. It's probably back in early February. And that threat management group brings together the best brains in our organisation to advise on a series of key topics. And those key topics are rugby, of course, both domestic and professional, our stadium and our facilities. They also advise on the finance of the organisation. And importantly and centrally, they relate to medical advice and government advice. So every single meeting that we have, and we have 3 meetings of the threat management group every week, we go through that agenda and cover relevant topics and advise the organisation, advise the business, advise our people how best to adapt and to change and to make decisions in the reflection of the information that we have before us. And like every organisation at the moment, we are tackling challenges on a daily basis. And I would, again, thank everyone that's involved with the threat management group, because they're doing considerable and important work to protect the sport in its broader sense in Scotland and to offer guidance to Scottish Rugby. Underneath the threat management group, we've got 5 working groups, again populated by others from across the business, feeding in the best expertise on things such as training, return to training for our elite players, that's our Glasgow and our Edinburgh players and their academy players. There's a group specifically looking at returning to playing when that's right and proper, behind closed doors, and also playing socially distanced. And we'll maybe talk about what socially distanced means in a moment or two. Returning to an office environment for our people. We have a number of our colleagues working from home. Many of our colleagues are on furlough just now, but when it's right and proper, we need to think about returning into an office environment, or at least running the business again in a different way. And then vitally and importantly, we have a community rugby group, which are focusing on advice, guidance, the challenges that are faced by our 230 clubs across the whole of the country. So we met with government and the Minister last week, along with Professor Jason Leach. And both Professor Jason Leach and the Sports Minister were very pleased and impressed with the presentation that had been developed by the Threat Management Group, which is lovely to hear. And secondly, they were aware of the challenge of returning to grassroots rugby. And we spoke at length around that particular challenge. And as a sport, rugby is no different to football. It's got the same challenge. So those conversations are ongoing with government around how the grassroots element can resume. But what we were focusing on initially on Friday was a roadmap, and a graduated roadmap for rugby to resume at the elite level, aligned to the government's own phased approach, which was released by the First Minister just a couple of weeks ago. And that would potentially see our players returning to what we're describing as a bubble at BT Murrayfield to train later in June, perhaps towards the end of June, to do individual training, with a roadmap that could potentially see behind closed doors taking place at the back end of August into early September. So that's the roadmap that we outlined. That's the roadmap that the government was supportive of. The roadmap is not without risk. And that risk is around us all just now, and we can see that in society. And we'll keep doing a reflection at every stage of that process. But that's what we're sort of working forward to with government just now. And we'll just keep that under constant review and assessment.
Dominic there mentions the risk. Now, the risk and the crossover between our professional game and our domestic game, there'll be many areas that will be very similar as far as getting returned to people being on the park playing the games. There'll also be other areas which are different and pose different challenges. Your team at the moment are working incredibly hard on a lot of the subgroups that Dom mentioned there as coming off the threat management group. to get as much communication out to the clubs. But the key point is it's at the right time, isn't it? It has to be led by government and led by what the threat management group and the wider subgroups are uncovering.
Yeah. I mean, I would say for us, the main focus is the safety of our rugby communities. And we will work within Scottish Government guidelines and advice, and we will return to play rugby when it's safe to do so. But really just to reassure people, as you've alluded to, we are working in the background to look at how do we support rugby or rugby clubs to start to train and to play again and to open their facilities as well. So we have got a group which is meeting actually today, which is looking at the club and the school game, and this will include Super 6 as well, and really reviewing against Scottish Government advice and what the clubs can and can't do. So we will be looking to send out some communication across all of our media platforms on Friday, so that we're sharing with clubs what they can or what they can't do at the moment. We will also be looking at the club and school game and looking at how can they return to opening their facilities. So we will provide some advice for clubs on how they can safely do that. So at the moment we're scoping out a piece of work which would support our clubs with the opening of their facilities and support with PAT testing, with gas safety checks, with water checks, the fact that the clubhouses might not have been used for several months at a time. So we are at the moment looking at how can we support our clubs and how can we support the game to return safely.
And one of the avenues you've used in that, Sheila, is webinars already, and I know the plans to look at how you can widen that out, working specifically on coaching, and a real opportunity for coaches in the domestic game to be learning all the time, sharing learning as well as the point you make about facilities and working with the Royal Bank on the rugby force element to help people. We're in unprecedented times, so help people understand what they need to do to get that facility back up and running.
Yeah, we are, as you say, Al, we're looking at a whole host of webinars from June through to the end of the year in terms of how do we support our club coaches, how do we support match officials, and how do we support generic club volunteers in the game as well. And as you say, sharing of best practice, and certainly through the work that we're doing about trying to get the game up and running again in Scotland, we are looking at evidence from other countries and other unions across the world and bringing what good practice we can get from other unions into what we're trying to do here in Scotland as well.
Just, I'm sure some of our listeners will be interested to hear the roadmap in terms of how you see the women's game coming back into play as well.
Yeah, so as part of the threat management group, one of the updates that we get regularly is from our colleagues in high performance. So Jim Allender and Stevie Gem will give us an update on what's happening in the world of high performance. And one of the particularly challenging areas at the moment is around the international women's game at the moment, because of the qualification for the World Cup and because of the preparation for the Sevens, for Team GB, for the Olympics, etc. So it's a really challenging calendar. There's a lot of great brains being applied to that. I'm not sure Stevie or Jim will thank me for describing them as great brains. But they're applying a lot of thought to working with our colleagues in Rugby Europe, which is a governing body for all European rugby. They're liaising with the Six Nations, and they're liaising with World Rugby to try and look at what that calendar might look like, not just for the rest of this year, but into the next couple of years to make sure we can restart the women's game at an international level appropriately. The women's game is an extra challenge in some respects because it is that blend of part-time and full-time. So, we need to be very, fully appreciative that there's a lot of sacrifices that the women's game make to take part in international fixtures. So the suggestion, which I know has been mooted out there, that there could be a series of international games for the women's team back-to-back, I think it's probably not that practical. So that's why I think a lot of thought needs to go into how best to gradually bring the women's game back when it's right and proper at the international level. But equally, I know within Sheila's group, there's a lot of work happening in terms of bringing rugby back and domestically. And of course, rugby domestically is about the whole game. It's about schools, it's about males, it's about females. And that's so important that we give some encouragement when we can to the whole game restarting in a graduated phase. And the reason I say it's so important is the obvious rugby reasons and the obvious societal reasons, but we've got to get the country fit. We've all been probably a little bit home longer than we ever might have liked, stuck behind the desk or stuck behind laptops. And the same applies to young people, kids. Kids need to get out there and get active and get fit and get healthy. And rugby's got an important role to play in that. We've said that to government. We want to play a role in helping them get the country fit and healthy. And when we can, and through Sheila's great work and her team's great work, we'll try and share some guidance and some support around getting the clubs back and the schools back to playing rugby. But it's going to be a while off yet. So it's about managing expectations as much as anything else. Everyone's working hard on that.
Yeah, as players, we're all very appreciative of all the work you guys are doing to try and get us back playing as soon as we can. James, just one for you. I imagine over the last couple of months you've probably been one of the busiest people in Scottish rugby. So just give us a little insight into kind of what your role's been around organising the return to some form of rugby within both the domestic and the professional game.
You're not wrong there, Rachel. It's been a busy time, but it's been a busy time for all of us. And I was going to say at BT Murrayfield and Scotstoun, but of course we're all remote. I can't believe how busy you can be sitting in front of a video camera, but it's been an education. It's not that long ago that I was trying to persuade HR that I should have perhaps one day a fortnight working from home. Now I'd relish having one day a fortnight being at BT Murrayfield. So, we're working towards that. It is truly a global and local pandemic emergency. There's no getting over that. And tragically, we've seen a number of deaths and my commiserations to anybody that's been severely affected there. From a rugby perspective, we've got to look at how our playing population have been, about considerations for the wider public, and map that against what the government are planning to do. And being locked down and isolated to start with seemed, a lifetime away, but we are still on the very first steps back to playing rugby. We're in phase one of the government's return, and for us that means that we haven't started yet for rugby. And as Dominic said, we're hoping and looking towards the end of the month, but that's very much down to how the conditions continue to improve. And that's really a case of pushing the government message, pushing the health message that everybody is in this to look after everybody else. And social distancing really does matter, and listening to the government advice is the only way forward. That said, I sit across all of the groups on the threat management because we recognise that a medical perspective is required for each of those. I'm sitting on some of Sheila's group. I sit on the return to office. I sit on the return to play. I sit on the return to training. Return to training is the first priority for us because you'll be the recipient of this. We need to get you fit again. This is the longest period of deconditioning we've ever known in my professional experience, and that means that we have to come back very, very slow, very gradual, very careful, very measured, and we can only do that when the government say it's right to do so. And that's really looking at the transmission rate, the prevalence rate of the virus in the community. It's looking at new infection rates, and it's mapping that with certain measures of release such that allows you guys to interact. And I'm sure you're desperately looking forward to getting out and running around and passing a rugby ball.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think, obviously the lockdown's been eased from a whole population point of view? Would that suggest that we are now starting to move in the right direction with the disease?
Undoubtedly, we're seeing numbers coming down. Unfortunately, the tail off is perhaps a little slower than we might have hoped. And by starting on that route of easing of lockdown, we're really at the start of an experience that we're hoping will go in the positive. But that can only go in the positive if we stick to the conditions. And the government are rightly looking at a 3-week sort of review period at the moment before they consider moving on to the next phase. And this allows, from a medical point of view, any changes in the number of cases coming forward to become evident in the data collection, and that will then inform the government whether they can continue that pace, whether they perhaps need to take a step back, but hopefully gradual steps forward.
Dominic, can I just come back to you with more of a business question? We've seen other unions in the past talking about, the size of the financial pressure that they're facing. What can you tell us about Scottish Rugby in that situation?
Yeah, I think we've spoken about before. It's significant and it's enormously challenging. Again, a bit of context. We are an organisation that drives its income from events. So if you think about that from a rugby perspective, that's about home games of rugby taking place, and around those home games of rugby taking place, there's three main income streams. One is sponsorship, partners like BT. Second element is television company broadcasting revenues, showing the games live. And the third and crucial element is around people coming into the stadium. So over the last year or so, we've had around 500,000 people on an annual basis coming through our turnstiles at Murrayfield and also at Scotstoun. So the income level that's generated through people coming through the turnstiles is significant. And as supporters will know, we've gone on a real journey over the last few years in selling out games. So we're a real interest to supporters to come and watch those live events. So it's a significant challenge at the moment in terms of our finances, and will be a significant challenge for a period of time, because what we've got to understand and try and get our arms around is the challenge of social distancing. So if you think about social distancing as a concept in a stadium setting, it's extremely challenging, because stadiums are clearly created in such a way to get as many people in, get a good experience, but you're all sitting close together. Social distancing clearly will not allow that to happen. So we've done a series of very detailed models, again, drawing on best practice from the States, people like the Miami Dolphins, the 49ers in America. We've brought in some information from Germany, from New Zealand, and our models are quite hard to read in some respects, because the financials are so significantly attached to having large stadiums. So we'll work with others. I've been invited onto a government panel to restart the events industry, and as part of that, we're going to have a think about working with government to understand if there's a way to be flexible on social distancing at major events, to perhaps reduce that current 2 metre level down a little bit. But again, that needs to be based on scientific advice and medical advice, and we'll look to do that with collaboration with government and other event organisers over the coming months. But until we get some clarity around potential reductions on social distancing, the financial impact to our sport, and of course our sport generates the revenue at the top end that filters all the way down to the areas that Sheila looks after and the clubs are perhaps one of the beneficiaries of. It's vital for us to restart, but it's an enormous challenge right now.
Sheila, Dom mentions the finances of Scottish Rugby, and one thing that was recognised straight away was that clearly involves the clubs as well. They've lost their ability to generate revenue. So one thing that was put in place was the Club Hardship Fund. Could you give us an indication of how that was received and what stage you're at with it?
Yeah, I mean, just as Dominic says, talking about sponsors, we've seen our clubs losing sponsors. There's no opportunity for them to generate income at the moment. So I think quite rightly so, we as an organisation looked at the Club Hardship Fund. So we had 82 applications to the Hardship Fund, and we have made 82 awards. So every club that applied are getting something. Okay, some of the clubs might not get what it was that they originally applied for, but every club will get an investment from us. So we're looking the week beginning the 8th of June to actually communicate to each of the clubs what their award has been. And then we'll look to have that investment into, or to release that investment into the club bank accounts on the 30th of June. So I think there's been a great recognition from the clubs in terms of the support that we are providing through the CHF fund. And, we really hope that we support clubs to become a little bit more sustainable than they might have been if we hadn't actually created the CHF fund. So it's been very well received by clubs in general.
James, Dom touched on the social distancing aspect of obviously fans coming into the stadium, but from a kind of return to training point of view, how is the social distancing going to impact how we gradually kind of return to training, and how will that impact what the players can do?
At the moment, you know that you can get out now for unlimited time to exercise, and you know that you can meet up with one other household, so perhaps in the parks, or if you've got a big garden, Rachel, I'm not sure, but you could do some socially distanced training with with a friend. What's important there is, of course, you can't share equipment, so using a ball at the moment would not be appropriate. So it's down to the running, and that's what we're looking at. You will know that pre-season is the portent of strength and conditioning, and they're desperate to beast you guys. So they want you out doing, even just straight line running to start with, and social distances. And our plans for the professional players at the moment is to have them running in channels of 17 metres apart. So we're taking no chances with social distancing. We're going to a maximum. We've even built some outdoor gymnasium areas, because again, the science shows us that the chance of transmission, the chance of becoming infected is very, very much smaller outdoors. So everything's geared to outdoors and to simplicity. There's no getting away from the fact that having had this period of deconditioning, the key to getting reconditioning is simply getting out there and putting in the miles. So yeah, we're looking forward to introducing that. And then, of course, we need to plan for the next phase. But there's a certain element of wait and see at the moment, because the science behind the virus is very much a moving target. It changes almost on a daily basis. I can listen and I can read about things in the morning, and that may have changed or been enhanced or facilitated in the afternoon. It's as simple as that. And so week on week, we're getting a changing environment, and that's what the government are looking at. And that's why they've said that whilst the roadmap is there to give an indication, it is not hard and fast. And likewise, with the return to training, we have to be able to adapt. And I know that, if we have to continue for a week or two more in running and lifting weights, then that's no bad thing. It, of course, does present challenges with return to actually playing games, because it's very difficult to set a target date, but we do need to set dates because we need some planning to go into this, and we hope for the best and we plan for the best, but we prepare for the worst as well. So if changes have to be made, then that's what we need to do.
Dom, we heard from Sheila and James there that the key to all of this is clearly going to be the balance, working with government to make sure that the roadmap is flexible enough to change if things change within the wider society. But we've talked before about the enormous role that sport can play, and for us rugby in particular, and a return to some sort of normality from a financial point of view, but more importantly from a well-being point of view, from the ability to get people back out there engaged with our sport. How difficult is it to find that balance?
Yeah, so I guess from our point of view, our focus is all about our people. So our people have been absolutely magnificent within Scottish Rugby, particularly our colleagues that have had to go on furlough for a period. So, they've been absolutely magnificent and an integral part of the organisation grappling with this enormous challenge. But then when we look outside the organisation, we've got to make sure that every decision that we make and every piece of advice that we give is helpful for all the rugby clubs that we're working with, helpful for our supporters, and importantly that we share the information as appropriate with our sponsors. Because as James has mentioned already, things are constantly changing. And as a governing body, we need to give the most sound possible advice to our players, to our supporters, and to our clubs. And that needs to be utterly aligned to government advice. I suppose the sort of phrase that's often used at times like this is we're sort of all in it together. And I think it's really true that our players, our coaches, our sponsors, our grassroots clubs have really stepped up. Everyone recognises the enormous challenge that we're facing, and we need to think a little bit differently to tackle this virus and and its impact on sport. But there's no doubt that I think that the work that the threat management group have done to date, and that the information that's been cascaded has been really helpful, and there'll be more of that coming, as Sheila notes, to our clubs and to our players and to our coaches, as more information is effectively signed off by the government in our sort of phased approach. So big challenges around it, but people have really stepped up, which has been, I think, a mark of our sport.
And Dominic, one question for you, I guess, is around the Pro 14. I know you're heavily involved in that competition, in that tournament. Can you give us any update on the Pro 14? Yeah,
so we have, I guess, two things just to update on Pro 14 since we last spoke. We have concluded our our transaction partnership with CVC, who've invested significantly into the competition. So we welcome them in as a new partner, which is great. That's a real investment into the sport at a critical moment where sport is looking for some positive. That's a great indication that they believe in professional rugby, that they believe in that competition. So that's been a big, important development. And then the second thing is, how are we grappling as a league with this big challenge of getting our players, as James mentions, back fit? Because it will take 10 weeks plus to get our players back fit and physically ready to play our games. And then secondly, when is it going to be appropriate for the stadiums to reopen, aligned with the various government restrictions being lifted to have a competitive game? And what we're targeting at the moment is potentially some Pro 14 games, if things are right in terms of the various government and the sort of phased approach towards the end of August. That may move to September, but that's what we're targeting at the moment. And to James's point earlier, we need to have a date to target for. But our plans need to be adaptable because things are constantly changing. But I could envisage a scenario where we've got games, perhaps intercity derbies taking place at BT Murrayfield in our sort of hub environment at the back end of August. And then we're going to phased approach to more games taking place, again with the government restrictions lifting a little bit. And then we might see international rugby taking place again during November at BT Murrayfield. And it's really important that at every step, from training to contact training to games behind closed doors, we constantly risk assess, we constantly review, and we improve. And that will give the government confidence to allow us to graduate through the various steps.
James, I'm sure a lot of our players that are listening and fans alike as well will be interested, I guess, to hear of some of the rule changes that World Rugby have put forward. What are your views on these, and do you think they could make rugby safer sooner?
Yeah, I always welcome any initiative and that can improve player safety. You know, safety in the game is absolutely paramount. It's a contact sport, so injuries do happen. And certainly in the context of virus transmission, of course, we, along with other contact areas, be it sport, be it any form of business, have the duty to examine where we might modify practice. And I understand why the wider kind of professional, international rugby people have said that, yeah, thank you, but you know, we want to continue the game in the way that it is, so we'll look. But it gives us a chance to have a look at training, perhaps. You know, we can see what the law variations are. How might we translate that into modifying the training that we need, ultimately to play the normal contact game, but in actual fact cut down the chance of transmission and injury in training. So that's a welcome initiative. We also need to look from a community point of view, because of course what they've said is that the laws may be adapted locally, and that will be something that Sheila and her group in particular may visit. And it's difficult for me as a medic to determine whether any of these or all of these might be implemented. But as I say, underlining the fact that people are concerned enough to examine every facet of the game in order to make it as safe as possible.
Dominic, you mentioned events around BT Murrayfield, and that's a huge income stream for us. There was news over the weekend around the British and Irish Lions potentially playing a match at BT Murrayfield next season. Can you talk more about that potentially, and maybe any other sports or opportunities that you see could arise as maybe BT Murrayfield becoming a host for those?
It's sort of hard at the moment, Jamie, to look too far into the future. We're sort of living in the here and now very much in terms of planning with the team to look at getting the players back and fit and get them hopefully playing games later in August or September. But whilst we're also thinking about the here and now, we also need to give consideration to the longer term. And what Murrayfield has been amazing at is hosting big events and putting on a really special weekend of rugby, whether that's the European Cup finals that we've had, or whether that's the Magic weekends that we've had in the past, or whether that's hosting football. So we're a special place for big, high-profile events to take place. So we've always said that we're in the market for working with partners to bring new events to Scotland. So we're really excited about some of the things we might be able to do when eventually we get through this enormous challenge. And some of those things that we're in the market for are things like the Lions. You know, we put together before the virus came to Scotland or came to the world, we put together an amazing bid that would see the Lions having an incredible weekend of rugby at BT Murrayfield before they head off on tour to South Africa. I know that bid's been really well received by the Lions board, but at the moment it's just really speculation on the basis that there's a lot of things that need to happen between now and the Lions tour. But there's a wider point here, which is, could BT Murrayfield be used for events and for other sports in the way that we've got that sort of protective bubble environment? Absolutely. We've spoken to various football teams in the city of Edinburgh around potentially utilising our facility in the season ahead, and we'd be happy to do that if that's right for them and if it's right for us, on the basis that, I've said consistently on this podcast and others that we've got to collaborate. We're all in this together as a sport and as a society in Scotland, and if sport can collaborate, if football can play at Murrayfield to restart their sport, and that helps our sport restart in many ways. If we can share the best practice from the elite game, both in rugby and in football, to share with our colleagues in grassroots to restart the sport at grassroots level at some point, then we must do that. So there's I guess collaboration is very much the key moment for us, and it would be great to see Murrayfield being used. It lends itself to that just by the shape and the size and the scale of it. So you can imagine perhaps socially distancing for a football crowd in Murrayfield could be easier for them to do than in perhaps the smaller, tighter venues. But we'll get into that conversation in a bit more detail. We've got to offer everyone a helping hand, and we're keen to do that.
That's all from us this week on the official Scottish Rugby Podcast. But as always, we will be back next week with more exclusive content.